Hello, everyone. I'm Melissa Deckman. I'm the CEO of Public Religion Research Institute, and I'm just setting up my PowerPoint so we start on the first page instead of the middle. I am delighted today to be sharing results from our latest survey that maps abortion views across all 50 states in America. These are insights from PRRI's 2025 American Values Atlas. And joining me today is really a star-studded panel of some of the best journalists today working on coverage of reproductive policy. We have joining us Shefali Luthra. She is a health reporter with the 19th, and she also is the author of Undue Burden, Life and Death Decisions in Post-Roe America, which I would highly recommend for you to kind of take a look at if you get the chance. Also joining us today is Aleja, Hertzler-McCain. She is a reporter with Religion News Service, who I think does some of the best reporting on religion and American politics, to say more generally, but really does some, I think, insightful and work on the role of religion in helping us understand abortion attitudes in all 50 states as well. And finally, returning, once again, Elisha Brown was here a couple of years ago, I think along with actually Shefali. She's a staff writer with State's Newsroom, and they really are looking at politics happening in all 50 states. It's a really great resource. So I would recommend that you check out all of these reporters and their beats after our webinar. So why don't we go ahead and get started? So I'm going to start by providing a general overview of some of our major findings with respect to abortion attitudes. And really, there's much more information about this report by going online at our website, PRRI.org. We also have very recent reports that also hail from our American Values Atlas. So last month, we released a new report about Americans' attitudes on LGBTQ rights. And in February, we released a report on the spread of Christian nationalist views in all 50 states as well. So let's get started. So I want to talk a little bit about the survey methodology. So we were in the field all of last year in 2025, interviewing Americans about their attitudes on reproductive rights. We had more than 22,000 interviews take place. Because it's such a large sample size, in fact, we're able to really have a small margin of error for the full national sample. And I think it makes this data quite valuable. I'd also like to recognize that the survey was made possible through the generous support of Michelle Mercer and Bruce Goldman. All right, so let's take a look at trend data in terms of Americans' abortion views over time. So we've been asking at PRRI about Americans' views on abortion legality since 2010. And so there are a couple of things I think we can take away from this particular figure. So we know if we look at the gray bar, these are the percentage of Americans, all Americans, with respect to their support for abortion legality in most or all cases. Back in 2010, we found 55% of Americans supported abortion legality. That's actually gradually risen over the course of the past roughly 14 years. It now stands at 61%. So fully 6 in 10 Americans are supportive of the legality of abortion in most or all cases. Now, there was a slight dip from 2022 when we found it was about 65% of Americans supporting abortion legality. But still, I think in the last couple of years, we can say that a solid majority of Americans, in fact, are supportive of the right to abortion. Of course, when we look at partisans, however, we see a much, much different story. So we find, for example, that 86% of Democrats say that abortion should be legal in all or most cases, from 71%. And then with Republicans, it's about 38%. And notably, we see growing polarization over time with respect to abortion legality. Democrats started out at about 71% in our original survey data collection in 2010. It's now at 86%. With Republicans, a slight increase from 2010. But again, the parties are very polarized when it comes to issues about abortion legality. And this really should be no surprise to anyone, I think, who follows American politics. So one of the things we do at PRRI, of course, is we look at a lot of attitudes on various policies through a religious lens. And so in the next 2 slides, I'm going to be presenting how religious Americans, those who self-identify with particular faith traditions, feel about support for abortion legality. And what we find is that among Unitarian Universalists tend to be the most supportive of abortion legality. Only about 11% say that abortion should be illegal. We find also high levels of support among those who are religiously unaffiliated when it comes to support for abortion legality, about 82%. We find that, typically speaking, broad majorities of non-Christians, whether those folks are Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, and we'll see on the next slide, Muslim as well, and other non-Christian religions, tend to be broadly supportive of abortion legality. And we also tend to find high rates of support among Black Protestants, white mainline, non-evangelical Christians, and Catholics as well. When we look at the bottom half of this chart, we see here that there are four major religious traditions in America: Hispanic Protestants, Latter-day Saints, white evangelicals, and Jehovah's Witnesses, for whom only a minority support abortion legality. So in many ways, I think the religious picture is that most people of faith tend to be supportive of abortion legality. Now, we'll talk maybe a little bit later today and kind of unpacking some of these specific trends with respect to religion. For example, we find a little bit of a decrease among white Catholics and white mainline Protestants, and we'll talk maybe first about why we're finding some of those changes. But nonetheless, I think the broad picture here is that most people who identify with the faith tradition tend to be supportive of abortion legality. So another new aspect to our report, I mentioned earlier that we just released in February a new 50-state report looking at the spread of Christian nationalist influence in America. So we've decided in this report to look at the relationship between Christian nationalism and between abortion legality. And so what we have here are what we refer to as these four categories of Americans in terms of their adherence to Christian nationalist views. And we found in our most recent survey and analysis, about 11% of Americans are strongly adherent to Christian nationalist views. Another 22% are sympathetic to those views. They maybe tend to hold sort of Christian nationalist ideas, things like, do you think that America should be a Christian nation? Or do you think that Christians should have dominion over all areas of society? Things like that. So about a third of Americans fall into the camp of what we would call Christian nationalist adherents or sympathizers, meaning about 2/3 are very skeptical of that movement or wholeheartedly reject those kinds of ideas. And what we find is a very clear pattern, right? The more you reject Christian nationalist views in America, the more likely you are to support abortion legality. And in fact, those rejectors, these are Americans who just completely, I think, reject the idea of Christian nationalism. I mean, more than 9 in 10 say that abortion should be legal in all or most cases. But we'll unpack a little bit later in this presentation. In the report, the relationship also between gender attitudes and abortion legality. Christian nationalist adherents and sympathizers tend to hold far more traditionalist views when it comes to abortion attitudes. We'll see that shortly. So one of the things we've been monitoring too is the relationship between age and abortion attitudes. One of the things in our larger report is we find that essentially in the past few years, there's been really sort of a merging of age when it comes to attitudes about abortion. Historically, older Americans have tended to be more likely to oppose, or less likely, I guess, to support abortion legality. And now we find in our most recent data that age differences really don't necessarily matter as much when it comes to abortion support in our most recent survey. Another thing we found in recent years is that there is essentially a growing gender divide when it comes to a support for abortion legality. So our current data finds that 63% of women compared to 59% of men support abortion legality. Historically, if you were to go back into survey research 10, 20, 30 years ago, there really weren't many gender differences, but this is something I think that's interesting to kind of monitor. However, when we look at younger Americans, we do find some gender gaps that are larger or smaller, depending on which category we're looking at, also by party. So the most overwhelmingly pro-choice, I guess, or group that supports abortion rights in America are young Democratic women. 91% support abortion legality, but still a very, very strong majority of young men do as well, 82%. We also find among 50 to 64-year-olds a slight gender gap when it comes to Democratic women compared to Democratic men. But I think the overall takeaway from a lot of this data is, regardless of age category, generally speaking, Republican men and women are far less likely to support abortion legality. Democratic men and women are far more likely to support abortion legality. All right, so let's turn to the state level attitudes about abortion policy in terms of our 50-state heat map. And so one of the cool things about the American Values Atlas with 22,000 interviews is that we're able to plot attitudes about abortion legality in all 50 states. And so here, if you look at this heat map, you'll see the darker blue colors denote far more support for abortion legality among state residents. The lighter green that you get, the less support there is for abortion legality. And really only in one state, in Utah, can we say very clearly that a minority of state residents oppose abortion legality. It's 36%. Now you'll notice there are a lot of lighter green states where, for example, on the heat map currently, you look at a state like Louisiana or Wyoming or Idaho, and you see that there's less than a majority level of support for legality. But because those are smaller sample sizes, essentially with fewer state residents, the margin of errors are a little bit bigger. So we can't say with definitivity that a minority of those state residents oppose abortion. But look to the coast. I think that's an important story politically to think about. So we see in what we might call traditionally blue states, those who tended to vote for Democrats, both in terms of congressional representation in recent presidential elections, we see far higher supports of abortion legality in those areas. And so if you were to overlay this map against the most recent 2024 Electoral College map, you would see some patterns, certainly. The other thing I want to point out, though, is when we asked Americans about their attitudes on abortion, we also asked, really, do you think abortion should be illegal in all cases? And so this is essentially the most kind of strict viewpoint on abortion, even in cases of rape and incest. So what we find is that relatively few Americans, in fact, 8% nationally, say that abortion should be illegal in all cases. And really, we do not find even close to majority support for that position across the nation. We do tend to find, again, less support maybe in some of the, the West Coast, East Coast states here, but even here in states like Texas, in states like Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, we're not finding that most state residents think that we should ban abortion, essentially. Okay, so next I wanted to turn to a profile of Americans who are supportive of or oppose abortion legality here. So here we're turning to a different shape. We call these donut sort of figures here. And so again, on the left, this gives you a sense of how respondents in our survey look when it comes to partisanship. So we find currently in our survey that 31% of Americans identify as Republican, 28 identify as Democratic, 26 as independent, and 15% as saying there's some other party or they're not quite sure what their partisanship is. But if you compare that chart, that donut graph, with abortion legality supporters on the left and abortion legality opponents, the takeaway here is that on the right, we find that more than half of Americans who oppose abortion are Republican. Whereas among those who support abortion rights, it's just 19%. So clearly a disconnect. Not surprisingly and correspondingly, Democrats, abortion legality supporters are far more likely to be made of Democrats than abortion legality opponents. But one of the things I think is kind of notable here is that, we do see some crossover, right? So even among Democrats and Republicans, there's not necessarily a uniform position when it comes to abortion legality, but we're far more likely to see Republicans who are abortion legality supporters than Democrats who oppose abortion. Turning now to education levels, consistently survey research finds that there is a relationship between education and support for abortion. And what we find is that about 2/3 of the country are non-college graduates, about 1/3 are college graduates, but there's definitely a divide when it comes to education. So education supporters are far more likely, 10 points more likely to be college graduates than those who oppose abortion. So now we have a few more donut charts here, and we're looking at the break between Christian category, or rather religious categories, and then Christian nationalist categories. So on the top row, we know that about 4 in 10 Americans are white Christians, about 1 in 4 are Christians of color, another 6% of Americans come from non-Christian religions, and then about 27% of Americans are religiously unaffiliated. If you look to the right, however, what we see is that those who support abortion legality are far more likely to be religiously unaffiliated. In fact, 3 times as likely as those who oppose abortion. So there is definitely a religious component to helping us understand abortion attitudes. Also, I would note too, among abortion legality opponents, more than half are white Christian. If you were to look at our latest Census of American Religion, which was released last week, you can find it on our website, you would find that approximately close to 6 in 10 Republicans are white and Christian. So there's definitely overlay between those two statistics. Finally, looking at adherence, sympathizers and skeptics and rejectors of Christian nationalism, what we find is that among abortion legality opponents, the far right corner, disproportionately, those folks are more likely to hold Christian nationalist views. In fact, close to 60% of those who oppose abortion are either adherent to or sympathetic to Christian nationalist ideas. We do not find that relationship really taking place at all among abortion legality supporters. And so lots of charts here, but really, really quickly, the upshot of this figure is really to show the relationship between religion and between support for opposition to abortion legality. And we know that people that oppose abortion tend to be more religious in terms of their regular behavior. And so if you look on the right hand here, we ask Americans the extent to which they're praying weekly, they're reading biblical scripture or reading religious scripture regularly, and how often they're attending religious services. And we see clearly that among abortion legality opponents, those kinds of religious behaviors are far more frequent among those Americans. It's not to say that that abortion legality supporters are completely non-religious. In fact, we find elements where they're likely to pray on a regular basis, maybe reading scripture and even attending services. But again, it's very clear when you look at those who oppose abortion, they tend to be more religious. Finally, we couldn't let our latest report go by without looking at pronatalism. This is a set of policies that we're hearing a lot about recently in American politics. And last fall, with the Brookings Institution, PRRI asked some questions about pronatalist policies. And so we wanted to look at the relationship between that and abortion support. So on the left-hand side, we see that among Americans, we asked about this direct pronatalism question, right? We asked Americans, do you favor policies that encourage Americans to have more children? It's not a necessarily overwhelmingly popular view in America. Just 41% of Americans say they favor those policies. But we see a clear 20-point divide when it comes to Americans who oppose abortion, those who support it. So among those who oppose abortion, they're far more in favor of such policies, compared with just 34% of Americans who support abortion legality. We've also asked pretty regularly in our data set about this concept of sometimes what we call gendered nationalism. And so this is an idea that society has become too soft and feminine. There's been lots, I think, of talk of masculinity in American politics in recent years. We find 42% of Americans agree society has become too soft and feminine, but clearly there's a big divide between abortion legality opponents and abortion legality supporters. Really, those who oppose abortion are twice as likely to endorse this sort of view. We also asked about the extent to which young men are struggling more than women in society. This is, I think, an idea that's taken on a lot of steam in the last couple of years, especially in wake of Trump's unexpected performance among younger male voters. 42% of Americans tend to agree with that sentiment, but there's a slight divide here, a 10-point divide when it comes to attitudes about abortion. Finally, we took on the question of this notion of a zero-sum game mentality, right? Some people on the manosphere, some men argue that the real problem in America, of course, is that, women have made too many games and it comes at the expense of men. That view is generally not supported by most Americans. But again, we see that those who oppose abortion are twice as likely to agree with that. In fact, more than twice as likely than those who are supportive of abortion legality. I think with that, that was a lot to get through. So I want to turn it over to our great panelists here for their thoughts and impressions on essentially, the major findings and takeaways from the survey, and what our findings might say with respect to current state policy. Also, I wanted to remind you, for our followers, if you have any questions for our panelists, please submit them to the Q&A box below. But I'm going to start first with Shefali for her thoughts on what she found interesting in the report and what this might help us understand about politics today with respect to reproductive rights.
I think what I'm so struck by is that the numbers in the past few years, there's been some variation to your point, but it's fairly consistent in that Americans largely support abortion. Americans in most religious groups, most demographic groups support abortion, and yet our laws don't reflect that. And I keep thinking about that chart, looking at how people feel about total bans, and it is really, really striking that roughly the same share of voters in Texas and California think that abortion should be banned in all circumstances, and yet their laws are so different. I think this is really worth pondering as we think about what national politicians do and how they talk about abortion, the extent to which this comes up as an electoral issue, but also what avenues voters actually have to articulate their views on this and whether they are given a chance to actually influence the policy that shapes their lives. In a state like Texas, they are not. In Florida, they were not necessarily given the same level of input as voters in, say, Vermont or California because of this two-thirds rule they had there around amending their state constitution. And I just think we need to keep contextualizing this as we talk about abortion in politics and policy, that the laws that we have in effect are quite divorced from where voters are. What does that mean for our democracy, how it works, and also what it means to actually build policy and government that reflects the actual people who live here?
Thank you. Sorry. Elisha, you cover state politics as well. So maybe kind of build on what Shefali was saying or add some additional thoughts as to what the findings say about what's happening on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. As Shefali was saying, and as you discussed in our interview yesterday, there's clearly a disconnect between anti-abortion policies across the country and Americans' views on the issue. And I think the places or the times when Americans have the ability to push back against elected officials is when abortion is directly on the ballot through a ballot initiative. And, we have seen ever since the Dobbs decision that there have been successful abortion ballot initiatives in states that voted for President Donald Trump twice, really. I'm thinking about Arizona, Missouri, and Ohio, for example. Yet those three states still have Republican-led legislators, right, that have continued to introduce anti-abortion proposals despite voter support for abortion rights. And I think what's really interesting and useful about PRRI's heat map is that you sort of see, it's zooming in on what each specific state thinks about this issue, right? So abortion will be on the ballot in at least three states this fall. And Nevada, according to PRRI, 74% of Nevadans who were polled in this survey say abortion should be legal in all or most cases. In Nevada, voters will decide on an abortion referendum or a reproductive rights referendum, actually. And in Nevada, voters have to vote twice to change the constitution, right? So that was approved during the 2024 election. And then, of course, in Virginia, abortion and the right to fertility treatments, the right to pregnancy care, what have you, will be on the ballot. And y'all have found that 63% of voters believe abortion should be legal in all or most cases. What was really interesting and sort of a conundrum, I think, for a lot of different policies in America is Missouri. And so you all found that 45% of people polled say abortion should be legal in all or most cases. And then what happened in 2024 was that a slight majority of the electorate said, hey, we want to put the right to abortion up to fetal viability with some exceptions for the life and health of the pregnant person in the Constitution. Of course, we've all seen the pushback between that law and the Missouri elected officials, right? And so now it's on the ballot again because in Missouri, the legislator has the power to confer an amendment to the ballot. So it's interesting what will happen. It seems like there is less of a campaign as there was from reproductive rights supporters the last go round. But again, those sort of campaigns gear up in the summer. So that's particularly compelling, and it makes me wonder. I don't actually know if, Missouri voters would want some sort of middle ground, maybe a 20-week abortion ban or what have you. So yeah, those are my big takeaways.
Thank you. Aleja, why don't you share some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I think what the thing that jumped out to me, I'm always looking for any shifts over time when I'm reading a report like this, and it was surprising to see that there had been a shift among white Catholics and white mainliners. So both groups still have a majority of people who support abortion legality, but since just 2024 to 2025, that's 1 year, you're seeing white Catholics go from 62% support to 57% support for abortion legality. Among white mainliners, you're seeing it go from 69% support to 65% support. So that's significant and stands out. And I went and asked for the breakdown of the data to kind of try to see who's driving those shifts. within white Catholics and white mainliners. And the standout for me was that it's, largely among Republicans that are shifting to be even more anti-abortion. Also among Catholics, white Catholics, that shift happened among independents. And so when you think about that, a big part of Donald Trump's base that got him elected in 2024 were white Christians. And then you see subsets of that group becoming even more anti-abortion, even as there's still significant parts that favor abortion rights. I think it raises a lot of questions on how this administration is going to deal with the demands of the part of the base that is really, really committed to an anti-abortion position. And I really saw that at the March for Life this year that I covered, that there was a lot of frustration with the Trump administration for not really seeming committed, according to some people there, to making anti-abortion gains. And it was to the extent that JD Vance had to address it from the stage and say, I know that some of you all have concerns. So to have to address it from the stage kind of like really shows the extent to which that was felt there. And even among the crowd, you had people that had signs about Trump had made some comments about being flexible about the Hyde Amendment. Like there are some serious concerns among this base, which, the data shows it's a minority, but they're loud, they vote. And it seems like there have been small swings toward that position among parts of the base.
Yeah, I kind of want to take kind of go off of that kind of particular observation that you had. Aleja was very we were glad to get you that data to look under the hood of what's happening with respect to white mainline Protestants and white Catholics. 4 points drop in support among white mainliners and 5 point drop among white Catholics, still majority support there. But, I was also struck in looking at that analysis is the role of, I think, movement, especially among Republicans and among Catholics with independents. So I'm just kind of curious for the whole panel, as we are gearing into the midterm elections, what is your take on what's happening nationally with the GOP with respect to abortion politics? My personal kind of observation, I think in 2024 after Dobbs, was that there was less emphasis by the national party to talk about abortion because there was a sense that, Trump delivered in the sense of a Supreme Court that overruled Roe, and now the states are handling it. And so we don't necessarily want to wade into those waters, and talk about something that we know most Americans tend to not be happy about. But is there a sense, are you seeing some shifts among the GOP, either nationally or with respect to some state pocket levels of GOP, where there's a renewed emphasis now on trying to turn up more maybe anti-abortion sorts of politicking? So Aleja, I don't know if you want to kind of go from there, and then we'll see what other folks are seeing in their reporting.
Yeah, I mean, I actually saw Elisha had reported that Senator Josh Hawley had introduced a bill to I believe it was ban mifepristone, which is a key demand of the anti-abortion movement right now, as they want to see the federal government take action on that. Whether like other national Republicans are going to line up behind that, I'm curious to hear if Elisha has more. But I do think the focus right now is a lot on the war in the Middle East. The focus is on cost of living issues. I'm not seeing it become like kind of a mainstream Republican conversation, even though there are parts of this, specifically very vocal, Christians who feel that there needs to be movement on this. So I think there is going to be a bit of a reckoning, but when are we going to see that publicly? I don't know.
Elisha, why don't you maybe take off from Aleja? She mentioned one of the articles that you wrote. So in terms of the politics happening here among Republicans.
Yeah, Senator Hawley of Missouri has been really a top vocal abortion opponent in Congress, and he, has been pressing the Trump administration to act more on mifepristone. So that was the bill that the senator introduced recently. I believe it was in March. I don't think it's gone much of anywhere right now because, as Aleja was mentioning, there's so much focus, for instance, right now on the budget and immigration. And my colleague Sophia just reported that Speaker Johnson and House Majority Leader Thune are not interested in extending the Planned Parenthood defunding provision, right? That was in last year's reconciliation package. That doesn't mean, based on what they said, me just reading the statements, that there won't be other avenues to restrict access of Medicaid reimbursements for abortion providers. For instance, Senator Hawley in the past has introduced a bill that would essentially defund Planned Parenthood. And just to be clear, even though the focus from the anti-abortion movement is about defunding abortion providers, the federal Hyde Amendment prevents federal funding of abortion except in a few circumstances. So Planned Parenthood and other independent providers affected by that provision in Maine and Massachusetts had said, this has affected access to birth control and other reproductive health care services. Yeah, so I think top line, you have also Senator Cassidy. Yesterday, he grilled Secretary Kennedy about the ongoing study of mifepristone. Senator Kennedy didn't budge. That's really been, the Trump administration's stance and strategy on mifepristone. In the courts, they have, said, we're working on this review, and that's all we can give you, right? So yeah, there's some question as to whether or not after the midterms there will be more interest in abortion policy at a national level. But then in state levels, particularly in states where abortion is already banned, like South Dakota, you have more measures against abortion pills being passed. South Dakota has been one of the few states that has passed anti-abortion bills this session so far. And you have Mississippi as well, just pass a punitive abortion pill measure. So that's been the focus from the states. And then the sort of non-successful type of abortion policy have been bills that would essentially open women up to prosecutions for getting abortions. This week, you're seeing that play out in South Carolina. GOP senators state senators have said they don't support that. I think it's clear from PRRI, in terms of these bills would essentially make abortion illegal in all cases as well, like rape, incest, fetal anomalies, right? And you're seeing the data showing that Americans just simply do not support punishing women or no exceptions for victims of sexual assault.
Shefali, what are some of your thoughts on what's happening in the GOP and abortion politics right now, especially as we head into the midterms?
One element that I found really striking is as we're seeing more polling in this Trump presidency, even though opinion on abortion, there's some variation, but relatively static, abortion is not the priority for voters that it was in the presidential election. It has, in fact, taken a back seat to issues such as cost of living, the war, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I've been noticing is this divide amongst Republicans, activists, lawmakers, politicians, etc., whether you are statewide or running in a more local way, how you talk about this and how you navigate the fact that these more extreme measures are unpopular and that this is no longer a priority issue. So you see someone like Senator Cassidy really focusing on this issue, being hailed by groups like SVA Pro-Life America as one of their pro-life champions. And he's in a very difficult primary. This is a signature issue in a state that your data shows abortion bans are much more popular. Someone like Josh Hawley is largely believed to be planning a presidential campaign, and those will begin in earnest after the midterms. And so something like his mifepristone bill is also a chance to issue some messaging and suggest that if he is the successor to Donald Trump, he will be a more stalwart anti-abortion champion than this administration has been. And I think that's really helpful for us to think through where we are. A lot of the sort of rank and file voters, the voters who the administration and Republicans in general are trying to hold on to as we enter the November elections, are not necessarily going to be turning out because they want more abortion restrictions. They are going to be turning out because of prices, because of concerns about affordability, because of the war, etc. But we can think a lot about how these different bills, these different policy approaches, and these different messaging statements suggest where the party might be headed after the election when they are a bit more insulated from this broader campaign and instead are thinking about something more partisan like a primary.
Yeah, these are all, I think, very good points. Actually, to your point, Shefali, I went back and looked at our American Value Survey. So every year we ask Americans the extent to which a number of issues are critically important to them. And we found, in fact, last year that abortion had dropped to 28%. That was the lowest we'd seen in the last 5 years. I mean, we did see a surge of it rising as an important issue in 2022 after Dobbs, I think was on a lot of people's minds, but it really has fallen, I think, in terms of the priorities that we're seeing. And I could imagine in that environment, maybe it's easier to slip through some policies that might be unpopular in some states because it's not top of mind for a lot of voters.
And I actually, to your point, that reminds me of some really good reporting ProPublica did a few months after the Dobbs decision, where they actually heard lawmakers say exactly that. We are saving some of our more politically unpopular abortion restrictions for a few years down the line when hopefully people are paying less attention, the shock is less fresh, and they care less.
Yeah, but even just, I mean, some of the more extreme measures, Elisha talking about what's happening in South Carolina. I mean, based on Elisha's great reporting, I don't get the sense that it's going to probably pass, but it did pass through a committee. And this is essentially a law that would jail women who got an abortion at any time in the process, right? I mean, that is, and we've seen, I think, recent data, past survey data rather, I should say, shows that that kind of punishment of women is broadly unpopular. And frankly, I think that those Americans who are leaders of the movement who want to, restrict abortion access have often talked about we don't want to punish women, right? So I think that's a really notable development. So we'll have to see where that goes. So this is not directly related to maybe abortion legality per se, but the broader, I think, venue of reproductive rights more generally. We've heard a lot about the MAHA movement, in terms of its questioning about the safety and efficacy of oral birth control, things like that. But I'm just kind of curious, have you, in any of your reporting, seen any overlap between MAHA and more traditional, I think, quote unquote, pro-life sort of advocacy groups? So just kind of anyone want to take that question? I'm kind of curious about that relationship because we've read so much about it.
I'm happy to jump in to start, although I'm very curious what other folks are hearing. I spent a bit of time last fall at one of those restorative reproductive medicine facilities, right there, really touted by abortion opponents as an alternative to IVF because you don't do IVF, you just do literally everything else and hope that it works. And what was fascinating for me to hear was this effort to, how I perceived it, was almost co-opt the language of MAHA and say, we know that what we are promoting is more popular because of this growing MAHA movement, because influencers are talking about Oura rings instead of birth control. They are talking about getting away from pharmaceuticals, and maybe as a result, we can encourage them as well to come into our anti-abortion, anti-IVF, etc., more skeptical of medicine fold. I don't know that we have enough data or reporting yet to indicate whether that goes the other way, whether people who identify as MAHA and maybe have some more skepticism of hormonal birth control will naturally go in that direction toward the anti-abortion sector. But there is a very clear possibility for symbiosis that at least one side is taking advantage of.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. My colleague Catherine Post has done some excellent reporting, and I think at this point, my understanding is that it's anecdotal, but some of these influencers on the right have said, like, yeah, we're that they're seeing that shift among their own followers, and that their kind of entry point for a lot of people to listening to them is kind of more health concerns. I think, in this era as people had a lot of health changes with the COVID-19 pandemic, and a growing interest in health, and looking for kind of influencers who might be talking about health. That might be their entry point to listening to these podcasters, for instance, and then from there, kind of trying to usher them more into Republican or anti-abortion attitudes. And the other thing that kind of stood out to me covering the March for Life this year was just talking to people who really didn't seem very politically aware. Like, people are coming all the way to DC to show up for a march, but when you ask them, oh, what do you think the Trump administration is doing on these issues? Like, it's clear that they're not actually tuning in. So I think, on a day-to-day basis on what's going on. So I think there is like a significant set of people who have more of like a cultural or like a kind of pop cultural tie to this, who aren't necessarily like activists or like very tuned into the news or very traditionally in that kind of politics camp who will kind of have a more hazy sense of what's going on, but because they have a tie-in through basic values like babies are good or, other, and that kind of ties into what the pronatalist thing we're talking about, don't have a lot of specifics, but are still ready to show up for the March for Life, ready to vote, for anti-abortion politicians, etc.
Elisha, do you have anything to add on MAHA and reproductive rights and the politics that are happening? Or is it showing up in your reporting?
Yeah, I will say Shefali and Aleja covered it pretty well, like from the bottom top. I think the only thing I could add is that the Trump administration, I think, is aware of this sort of skepticism of hormonal birth control, and two budgets that were recently released, proposed budgets, that is, for HHS. And there was the White House or the presidential budget in the next application cycle for the Title X program, family planning program. There is, a line in there about how, hormonal birth control, people have talked about side effects to that or what have you. And yeah, I think that they are sort of reflecting what maybe some fears are on the right or the Maha side of the right, which to be clear can, include progressives, right? So yeah, I think that'll be interesting going forward, especially from HHS to see how they will respond to those type of fallacies about birth control, about hormonal birth control that are rampant online.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, my understanding is that those who oppose, I think, reproductive rights more broadly, are using FDA regulatory means as a way to sort of, deny access to some of these things. And I think one interesting analogy I read is that, in banning sort of hormonal treatment for young transgender kids, right? The kind of the same idea, like if the FDA can start to ban those sorts of treatments that deal with hormones, the next step might be to really start to place stricter regulation on hormonal birth control. But I will to be very clear though, when we've asked about this question, I've seen other polls, access to hormonal oral contraceptions is broadly very popular. Even among Republicans, strong majorities of Republicans say this should be legal, in fact. So I think that'll be interesting to see where that debate takes us, like whether the FDA under RFK Jr. is willing to kind of essentially try to roll back access to oral contraceptions, which I think most experts would say have been used for decades and are safe, right? So I think it's interesting to see where this is all going to end up. We do have a few questions in the Q&A. We have time for a few more if folks are interested and want to post some questions into the Q&A box. So one observer asked, could you please speak more about the increased number of states with only a minority of residents who believe abortion should be legal in all or most circumstances, and the increased number of states that have more than 10% of residents who should believe it should be illegal versus PRRI's past two American value atlases? Yeah. So I think if you were to look at our 50-state heat maps, you would see a decrease in some states when it comes to abortion legality. The one caution is that really it might also just be a function of margin of error. A lot of those states are pretty sparsely populated. And so we do our best in our analysis. We have more than 22,000 interviews, but some states are just very hard to reach because they have very, very few residents. Let's say like Alaska or Nebraska, or not Nebraska as much, Nevada, North Dakota. So I think I would just caution to read too much into it because I think there might be a margin of error effect happening here. But certainly it's something that we're definitely keeping our eye on to look at these trends kind of moving forward. One question asked about Gen Z men. I write a lot about gender and the growing gender divergence we see among young Americans with respect to a wide variety of opinions. So this question is, with all this discussion about Gen Z men, does your data on abortion legality shed light on what's going on? I would just note that pretty consistently, even though we do see that young women tend to be a little bit more supportive of abortion legality than young men, majorities of young men still support abortion legality. So I think that's an important point to kind of talk about. But I'm actually interested, though, and I'd love to hear from reporters who are looking at younger Americans. It seemed to me in 2022 that Democrats performed better than expected in that midterm election cycle, in part because Dobbs had a lot of young women being far more animated to go out and to vote in the polls, and I'm not hearing as much chatter, because I try to follow Gen Z pretty closely among younger progressive women that abortion and reproductive rights tends to be the most salient issue to them. So I'm just kind of curious from your reporting, what's happening with Gen Z and reproductive rights, any stories or observations you might want to share. And I'll open up to the panel here.
I'm just thinking out loud a little bit, and some of this comes from reporting, and some of it, frankly, comes anecdotally just from talking to young, maybe people who'll be old enough to vote in these elections. And I mean, I think part of it really is that question of salience. I mean, the views have not changed. Gen Z women in particular likely will not be voting for people who oppose abortion rights. That is still very important to them, but it's just not something they're talking about because there hasn't been much news, much activity, right? Nothing to really change things either way. I mean, frankly, that's probably why we are not seeing movement on mifepristone right now, because that would suddenly make this a very salient issue for voters and could supercharge them as a demographic heading into this election. But I mean, a lot of them are thinking about things like if they're men, the draft. If they're women, thinking about like how they're going to afford different things. And that just seems like it really does take all the air right now. And it doesn't change how they feel about abortion, but it probably changes the extent to which it is something they talk about, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. I think if the politics were different, perhaps, as you noted, if there was really an attempt to try to restrict access to mifepristone, I think you'd probably hear more, you'd see more organization happening. But I do think the political reality right now is that the economy is trumping, to use a phrase, just about all other concerns we see pretty consistently in our own our survey research across age groups, but especially it hits younger Americans harder, I think.
One thing I've also been thinking about, and I thought about this a lot actually when interviewing people about their abortions, is people adjust to things pretty quickly. And I wonder if one element that's going on is even if people don't support abortion bans, they have become more normal to them. I mean, we accept a lot of things that people at one point find quite, shocking or jarring. They suddenly become more normal, and then it's something you think about less and talk about less because that isn't something you really perceive as something that can change. It just is your reality.
Yeah, and again, this perception that it's pretty settled now, right? Dobbs is done, and this is kind of moved to the states, and a lot of states, even in blue states, have moved to codify legal protections, right? And so there's a sense, I think, too, that not much is going to be changing, and so you kind of adapt to that sort of reality in some ways. I think absolutely. Other thoughts about younger people and reproductive rights? Any sort of activity you're seeing? Well, I'll move to another question. Someone writes, I'm concerned here in North Carolina that Congress is not aware that uniquely abled women must have birth control. I work part-time respite care for this population. It's very concerning. So, I think we talked a little bit about access to birth control and whether or not it will become an issue, before or after the midterms. I think it's something that we definitely need to keep our eyes on. Other questions, comments, other things you'd like to share from our survey results? Or final concluding thoughts as we think about what our findings are showing us today.
I would say something that you sort of touched on, Melissa, but maybe we didn't expand on that. I just think it's interesting and could be a starting point for the reporting, is that, the abortion opponents who are more likely to endorse pronatalism and this notion that the culture has gone too soft, has grown too soft, sort of support Christian nationalism. I think that's something that, I'd love to report on more, as particularly with pronatalism, right? Because there are demographers who wouldn't consider themselves, of course, Christian nationalists, who support pronatalism, but then there are these other type of policies, and there's this sort of question, I think, with the administration that it's like, okay, so you oppose abortion and you are pro-family, right? Particularly Vice President Vance has, talked about this. And so just looking at other policies that are happening, such as, what's going to come of these Trump accounts, or, what else are they doing to make it easier to have families if they want more people to have babies, right? And that's also connected to the economy. So it's all cyclical.
I do think the pronatalism movement is fascinating. It's like Maha, it brings together some, I think, strange bedfellows when it comes to politics. And I think there's a lot of legitimate concern, both here in the US and worldwide, that birth rates are falling, right? If you have fewer people having children, those are future workers who are going to pay into our system in some ways, right? And so there might be very valid concerns for, in fact, increasing the birth rate. But I think there's relatively little on the political right, at least, policies that really get at maybe having kids more affordable. I do think the Trump accounts are interesting, and that's a policy that I wonder if that, in fact, will carry over, into a new administration, if there's a Democratic administration. But I think there's a sense for many Americans that they just can't afford to have more kids, right? And so that's a challenge, I think, that we really haven't heard much from. I think, movements that oppose kind of abortion. If anything, the Christian nationalist movement, I think, would say, we want less government handout, and families should just be able to take care of themselves, of their children. Like, I think it's been interesting. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I will say
Yeah,
on that, it was a big talking point in Vance's speech at the March for Life this year. So that was his, it was kind of clear what he was coming in with to be his applause lines. One of them was announcing that he and his wife Lucia were expecting another child, right? That's kind of personally pronatal, and that got big applause. And then beyond that, when he talked about having a fourth child, he was touting the Trump accounts, touting the strength of the economy and made a joke about him and Usha kind of discussing, like, we've got to take advantage of that account. Let's do it, which was also kind of an interesting comment, because that's not how conservative Catholics tend to frame having more children, right? There is a natural family planning movement, but it would not be typical to talk about your financial kind of situation in the decision to have another child. But it absolutely was, like, I kind of perceived it as a rhetorical pivot where a lot of the wins they were touting on the anti-abortion side were things that had been kind of like re-upped, that had been done in the first Trump administration. And so in terms of trying to give the crowd like a list of wins, whether people perceive that rhetoric to be like translating into policy or are convinced, it's absolutely at least part of like JD Vance's rhetoric right now.
Great. Shefali, any final thoughts as we're setting to close out on our webinar today?
I just think all of this like remains very interesting. I am so curious to see, as the elections progress, the extent to which abortion possibly resumes its status as an election issue, maybe in smaller scale avenues, right? In governor's races, in state senate races, as voters think more critically about the way their lives have been altered. And I am really fascinated to something we were discussing earlier, the extent to which anti-abortion activists do in fact shape this election with an enthusiasm gap, and whether that matters. I think that's like a really interesting question. The movement seems very divided about it, but seems very revealing, and it's just absolutely worth our attention and probing, and this is kind of neat to think about.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good note to end on. I mean, obviously, we'll be continuing to monitor these developments as we head into the midterm elections. I want to thank each of you for coming today and sharing your insights. To those who are watching, please, if you don't already, you should be following the 19th and RNS and State's Newsroom, because I think they do wonderful reporting on a lot of topics that don't necessarily get a lot of airtime on the major news outlets, right? And so if you want to understand the dimensions of gender and religion and how they influence our policies, both nationally and at the state level, I'd really recommend that you follow our wonderful guest here. So thank you for joining us, and thank you at home for watching as well. Please follow our work at PRRI Poll. We're on Blue Sky, we're on LinkedIn, we're on Facebook. We also write regularly at our PRRI Substack as well. So please follow our work. And if you feel so inclined, feel free to make a contribution as well, as we are a nonprofit. Thank you all so much, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you.